software tool that over 50 oil and gas operators are using for a lot of multi-phase and advanced RTA techniques in the industry. There are a bunch of software courses that are coming up that I want to just mention, and the URL is at the bottom here, whitson.com/training. And so these are available to register for any of our Whitson software customers. There's also a bunch of PVT related courses that are available for members of the Whitson Academy. And again, they can be found at the same site, whitson.com/training here. Now, we often have excellent guest speakers like Yalda for these types of webinars. So if you go again to whitson.com/training, you can see some past and future webinars that are coming up in case any of these topics interest you. Finally, just before I introduce our presenter, on October 12th, we have a WhitCon conference in Houston, Texas. And this is really where we have engineers from oil and gas companies doing presentations of case studies, showcasing how they're using advanced RTA techniques to solve real practical problems. So you can contact Matthias, and his email is here, carlson@whitson.com. And you can find out more and get signed up for that. So this is going to be a really exciting one, specific for anyone doing RTA. All right, so with that, I want to introduce Yalda. So Yalda Barzin, she has her Bachelor of Science from Tehran Polytechnic, and then she got her Master of Science and IFP and PhD from the University of Calgary. Yalda has more than 10 years of really practical experience in industry from Phuket, where we actually work together, and then IHS, and of course, working with Repsol. If you've ever spoken with Yalda or benefited from a course that she's taught, you know that she is an expert in RTA, absolutely. And now she's providing Repsol with her expertise as a reservoir engineering advisor. So one thing worth mentioning too is Yalda actually won the 2020 ERTAC Award for the best paper, and this is the topic we're going to listen to today. So this is extra special. It's a big deal. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch to Yalda. And Yalda, are you able to share your screen now, if you don't mind?
Sure. Let's do that. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, it says choke management. It looks like the main slide.
Okay, sure. And can you hear me well?
Absolutely, yep.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, Graham. Thanks for the very nice introduction, and thanks for having me here today. I'm excited to talk about this topic. As you mentioned, it will be about choke management of gas condensate shale reservoirs. I'm going to talk about choke management, but this is not going to be your typical choke management talk where basically you're talking about the physical damage that's left in the reservoir due to aggressive drawdown strategy. In fact, I'm going to add a twist, and that twist will have to do with the liquid yields, as the title of the paper says. I would like to share with you how your drawdown strategy will have a direct influence on how much condensate you produce at the surface and how much you drop in the reservoir. Or in other words, I would like to show you how your choke management will drive your condensate gas ratio, and I would like to share those correlations that we've observed with you today. Now, before really focusing on the choke management for the condensate reservoirs, I would like to take a minute and talk about choke management in general and the challenge of managing the choke for shale reservoirs. In the last 10 years that I've been working with a lot of the operators, specifically in the Eagle Ford and Duvernay, one question that has consistently come up, maybe one of the top 3 questions, have always been, what is my optimum choke strategy? And this is a dynamic question, and operators often revisit and try to modify their strategy and optimize for their choke. For those of you who are coming from the unconventionals, specifically those who are coming from the subsurface discipline or production engineering or management, one way or the other, you have tackled this question of the choke management. Am I too aggressive or am I not aggressive enough? And today, hopefully, we will talk about that, and then we will expand it into the gas condensate shale wells. But before going into that, let me talk to you about choke in general. I think we can all agree that choke management is about finding a right balance. It's the challenge, and I would like to call it the art and science of finding the right balance between your initial high production rates, which is in other terms, high cash flow on production acceleration, versus the damage left behind in the longer term. And we know that for overpressured reservoirs, they suffer greatly if we deplete them too fast due to a whole host of mechanical damage that we can cause with aggressive drawdown strategies. There's multiple good studies in the literature that show that with proper choke management, we can minimize up to 40% the fracture volume loss. We can eliminate a lot of the fines and proppant migrations, and we can delay a whole host of other issues like proppant embedment and crushing. So in other words, to summarize, we are balancing between restriction to flow versus acceleration of flow. However, when we're talking about gas condensate reservoirs, which is the topic of this presentation, we are having an added layer of complexity, and that added layer has to do with your condensate gas ratio and optimizing for condensate at the surface. Our observations have shown from 100+ wells that you've analyzed in Eagle Ford and Duvernay that, again, as I mentioned, there is a strong correlation between your condensate gas ratio and your choke management. And for an optimized choke management, we will have to optimize our condensate gas ratio as well. And basically, that's what I'm going to talk to you about for the next 20 to 30 minutes today. But before diving into that, I would like to take 1 minute and give you an overview of how choke management has historically been in the KDB area, which is a fluid condensate-rich area in Eagle Ford. And I would like to use help from this next plot here to talk to you about that. This rather busy plot here is meant to show you the relationship between choke management historically and the commodity prices. So let's look at this plot, which is showing on the y-axis the percentage of drawdown at the mark of 6 months from the onset of production for these Eagle Ford KDB gas condensate wells for a particular asset that has historically been managed by 3 different operators. It's showing the percentage of drawdown from the year 2012 all the way to year 2020. If you look at these volume plots that I have here in amber, when these volume plots are bottom heavy, we are having a slow drawdown around 10 to 40% of depletion within the first 6 months, I'm sorry. And when they're top heavy, we are having a high degree of drawdown between 60 to 80% of depletion within the first 6 months. There is some bimodality in the first few years of development in the Eagle Ford that you can see that we have both classes of slow drawdown and fast drawdown up until year 2016. That's showing the trial period for the operators to gauge which kind of drawdown would lead them to an optimized production. However, you can see that from year 2017 and onwards, basically this particular asset has gone through much faster drawdowns. Now, if you have an added picture of the commodity prices that I'm showing here in this dark blue curve, we can see that in the first few years of development in the Eagle Ford, when the commodity prices were high, there were no particularly rush in production acceleration, and we're seeing this bimodality in drawdown. But as soon as the commodity prices dropped in 2015 and 16 and onwards, we can see that this uniform class of drawdown, which is 60 to 80% depletion in the first 6 months, which is what some people would call aggressive drawdown, and I would choose to call it fast drawdown versus the slow drawdown. Mind you, again, as I mentioned, this asset has gone through 3 different operating companies, and obviously 3 very distinct management policies. But what they all had in common in their policy and vision was that they managed their drawdown very much accordingly to commodity prices to create a high cash flow. 2 years ago, in year 2021, I had the opportunity to be the discussion lead of a topic in an SPE, a technical event that was focusing on the lessons learned from the past in the Eagle Ford. And I took that opportunity and I polled the audience on what they think about the optimum choke management for gas condensate wells in particular. And interestingly enough, only 13% of these operators supported, or the participants in this nice scientific poll, supported aggressive drawdown. The rest of the participants either did not support aggressive drawdowns or did not know what would be the optimum strategy, and said they're still trying to understand the strategy for gas condensate wells. So with that introduction on choke management in general, let's talk about what is specific to gas condensate shale wells and why the topic of this conversation is not choke management for all shale wells, and in particular, it's about the gas condensate. Because those of you who have worked with gas condensate wells, doesn't matter if it's in the conventional world or the unconventional world, you know that there's added layers of complexity to gas condensate wells. However, for shale gas condensate wells, there's particularly a couple intricacies that I would like to talk to you about in this slide. I'm going to just focus maybe on 2 main complexities here. So, number 1, the condensate phase that's dropped in the reservoir will likely stay in the reservoir. And this is from a paper, SPE number 155499 from Dr. Whitson, put out in the year 2012. This paper is including fundamental research on PVT of gas condensate shale reservoirs, and lays down this phenomena very beautifully. Basically, what I learned from this paper is the practical immobility of the reservoir condensate phase. Once we drop it in the reservoir, it's going to stay there, and we will not going to have a second chance to produce it later, very likely. So we better get it right at the first place. The second main learning for me was the producing CGR, producing condensate gas ratio at the surface, is equivalent to the in situ solution CGR at flowing bottom wall pressure. And they provided this plot that I'm showing here on the right-hand side, which is evaluating the liquid recovery efficiency of many wells that they had modeled in this compositional model at the 1000th day of their production at a constant bottom wall. Yes.
We're still seeing the price and choke slide. Is there another slide that you're showing?
Absolutely. So you are seeing this slide?
Yeah, we're only seeing, it says history of choke management in the Eagle Ford.
And how about now, the next slide?
No, it's still stuck on that slide. So what you could do is you could stop sharing and start
sharing again? Absolutely. Let me do that.
Oh, someone else says that they can see the slides changing, so it's just a problem with me for some reason. Okay.
Okay. If you can get a show of hands, if you can follow me on my last slide, which is.
It looks like.
Okay.
It's all good. Thank you, Yalda.
Okay. Okay. Absolutely. So back to this plot. What we can observe from this fluid efficiencies or liquid recovery efficiencies that were calculated at about 3 years into the production at a constant bottom hole pressure of 1,000 psi. If you follow these curves, they are from different initial reservoir pressures, and obviously every data point is from a different CGRI, or initial condensate gas ratio. If I follow the curve that is most representative of the KDB area of Eagle Ford, which is initial reservoir pressures of about 10,000 psi or more, and CGRI of between 100 and 150 mostly, we can notice that really between 40 to 60% of the in-situ condensate potential is produced at the surface, and the rest is left in the reservoir. So going back to the first point, that if we get it right the first time, that's the only chance that we have, and that makes characterization of CGR and condensation very important to production optimization of gas condensate reservoirs. What I would like to call it complexity number 2 is the relationship between CGR and flowing bottom hole pressure above the supposed or estimated saturation pressure. So the CGR profiles from shale reservoirs in many cases show a decreasing trend above the calculated, interpreted, supposed dew point. If you look at this plot here that I have on the bottom right side, in green dots, I'm showing the history of production CGR from a well in the Eagle Ford in the KDB area, and these produced CGRs are plotted against their flowing bottom hole pressure. And on the other hand, I'm showing you the RV, the solution CGR curve derived from classical PVT for this particular well in gray. The dew point for this well is estimated to be 3,800 psi around here. So we can see that classical PVT is implying a constant CGR, of course, above dew point. But what we in reality observe from this well and many other wells that exist in the unconventional reservoirs is that CGR keeps decreasing. So again, more reason why characterizing CGR is very important for optimization of production for gas condensate wells. So in the face of those intricacies, again, characterization of producing CGR is inevitable for production optimization, and that was one of our main objectives for this study. And in the process of studying these CGR curves, as I mentioned before, we learned that the CGR trends have a very strong correlation with the history of choke, which also provided us with a lot of learning and this background for us to go and come up with a new optimized choke strategy. That was the second objective of this study. Now, there are a couple main background studies that this our study benefited from. The first one and the main one for me was the paper that Whitson and Yalda put together in 2012 that I just mentioned a couple slides back. And the main learning from this paper was that CGR tracks flowing bottom hole pressure. And the results of the compositional modeling work for them show that CGR tracks flowing bottom hole pressure for as long as the well is in transient linear or infinite acting flow regime. And ever since this paper came out, I've been, since 2013, investigating the CGR trend of every gas condensate well that came my way, and try to track this correlation and see if it holds. And obviously, I learned more based on that notion and that concept. And with this study, I'm building on that concept. There was a second study put out in 2017 that looked at impact of absorption of CGR by Greg Walker, who's my co-author in this paper. from 2017 that offers a hypothesis on the anomaly of CGR above dew point. So with those objectives and these background studies, we looked at more than 100 wells in the Eagle Ford and Duvernay in the last couple years, and we could draw some main observations that repeated itself over and over for every single well that we analyzed. I'm going to give you here a summary of these 3 observations, and then for the next few slides, which is the rest of the presentation, I will go in details of these observations and expand on them. But let me just give you a summary of what we're going to look at. The first observation, as I have already mentioned a couple times, is that there was a strong correlation between the producing CGR and the corresponding choke history. Below the saturation point, below the dew point, CGR always tracks flowing bottom hole pressure. Now, as I mentioned, this 2012 paper was talking about how CGR tracks flowing bottom hole pressure during infinite acting flow, but we could see that CGR always, and regardless of flowing regime, will always independently track flowing bottom hole pressure below the saturation point. However, when the wells operated above the saturation point, for as long as we are maintaining a consistent and stabilized choke, that will promote a stabilized and constant CGR trend starting from the CGRI. However, a rapid increase in choke size triggers an immediate decline and a linear decline in CGR. And these two obviously will provide the underlying drivers of the main understandings for choke optimization, which is the topic of this talk. Okay, with that, now let's go into next 5-6 slides. I would like to take some examples to expand on those observations that I just mentioned. So analysis of many wells in the Eagle Ford and Duvernay had shown us that producing CGR will always follow the flowing bottom hole pressure. Now, we looked at many wells, more than 100 wells, these wells from different vintages, from different completion designs, from different degrees of richnesses, different areas and in the different plays. And however, what we noticed was that independent of the flow regime, which by the way, we identified the flow regime through RTA and numerical modeling for every single well that we analyzed, that independent of the flow regime, flowing bottom hole pressure and CGR will always track each other. Let's show you some examples here on the right-hand side. I'm showing you 4 different wells, and for every well, I'm showing you in green the CGR profile and in black the profile of the bottom hole pressure. The top 2 wells are around 14 months old, and the bottom 2 wells are around 18 months into their production journey. And again, these 4 wells are from both Duvernay and Eagle Ford in no particular order. They're from a CGRI of 100 to 250 barrels per million. And what you can observe from every single one of these is how closely CGR tracks bottom hole pressure. So after having observed and having explored this correlation between flowing bottom hole pressure and CGR, the next step was to understand now if bottom hole pressure is tracking so closely, and bottom hole pressure obviously is derived by the choke management, how would the choke itself correlate with CGR? So I went back through all these wells and started exploring the relationship between CGR and choke management this time. And I would like to take a few examples from Duvernay and Eagle Ford to talk about that correlation. Let's first look at this plot here at the top. Again, in green, I'm showing the CGR, the producing CGR, And in black, I'm showing the trend of evolution of choke size for multiple wells that are in 2 adjacent paths in the DeWitt County, in the Karnes County in the Eagle Ford. What we can observe is the CGR here from the onset of production consistently keeps decreasing at the same time while the choke size is being ramped up consistently and gradually. Once the choke reaches the target choke for these wells, it was around 30 to 33. Once we reach the target choke and choke stabilizes around a constant size, we can see that the CGR also stabilizes a constant value, obviously with a very tiny decline in slope that for all practical purposes, I would like to call it a constant CGR. And this trend of how CGR decreases while the choke size increases has shown itself over and over. And I will, in the next slide, show you more examples. But this was one class of a correlation between choke and CGR, that an increase in choke size, if you ramp it up, you will see an immediate decline, linear decline in the CGR. However, for these 2 wells at the bottom, I'm going to show you how a constant and stabilized choke will result in a constant CGR at CGRI for as long as the well is operating above its dew point. So these 2 wells down here are also from Eagle Ford. They come from 2 very different areas. They have different completion designs, and they come from different degrees of drawdown. This one is coming from a constant size of 22 for choke, and this one is coming from a constant 12 size for choke, and they come from different degrees of richness for the fluid composition. However, interestingly enough, you can see that for as long as that choke size is constant and stabilized, it can lead into a high profile of CGR that doesn't decrease and keeps constant at CGRI, which is the second class of correlations that we've observed, that a stabilized choke will lead into a stabilized CGR trend. More examples here, again from Eagle Ford. You can see that in the left side, these 2 wells that I'm showing you here are showing the same correlation. A stabilized choke is showing a stabilized CGR, whereas on the right-hand side for these 2 wells, and excuse me, these are not wells, these are paths of wells in the Eagle Ford. So there's multiple wells shown together from the same path. And again, on the right side, we can see that a ramp up in choke size has an effect in how the CGR will keep decreasing. And as soon as the choke stabilizes, we can see that CGR will stabilize. Here, on the left-hand side, I'm showing a plot that is zooming into the first 30 days of production from one of our newer Eagle Ford wells in the DeWitt County in Eagle Ford. And in yellow or amber, you're seeing bi-hourly CGRs that is coming from the Flowback reports. And also from the same Flowback report, you're seeing the evolution of choke size. In gray, I have tried to smoothen out the noise out of the bi-hourly data, which didn't really help much. But you can see that for the first 2 days, as the choke ramps up to its target size, during those 2 consistent 2 days of consistent increase in choke size, we can see that an almost linear decrease in CGR. And as soon as the choke stabilizes, again, we're having an almost constant CGR. Mind you that the first few days of production are affected by cleanup, as all of you know, and it would not be a good time to have a quantitative look into the data. However, qualitatively, we can observe that even with very high frequency data during flowback, we can observe the same trend of CGR declining with ramping up of the choke. One more example here on the right, very interesting. This is 2 wells that are sitting on the same pad in the Eagle Ford again. These are drilled at the same layer. They're from the same CGRI, same level of richness, exact same completion design, with the exception that one of these wells was managed distinctly with a higher choke size compared to the other ones. So let's call that well A, that I'm showing in black here, the choke profile in black and the CGR profile in black for well A. In contrast, I'm showing well B in green. So this is the choke for well B, and that's the CGR. And what is very obvious here, you can notice that the well that had a larger choke size yielded less liquid or condensation at the surface. So more and more of examples of how choke has a very direct impact on how much condensate they produce at the surface. Now, here I'm going to take a couple minutes, and I would like to share with you an example of a pad in the Eagle Ford that has staggered wells and multiple benches. On this cross plot section here, I am showing you 4 of the wells. I call them D1 and D2, which are at the deeper section of the lower Eagle Ford, and the wells S1 and S2 are the wells that are on the shallower section of the lower Eagle Ford. Obviously, we have more wells here in the upper target, in the upper Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk. I would like to show you this example and use this example to talk about how that knowledge of CGR being affected by choke can be used into a choke optimization. I will talk about how the choke management in this pad have yielded very distinct results in production of condensate and gas. But before diving into that, let's take a minute to talk about a hypothesis that is popular in the literature about the anomaly above the dew point for CGR, that decreasing trend of CGR. This hypothesis offers the notion that if you have wells that have fractures that grow into upper layers, different formations that are different in richness level. At the example of this particular pad, we're having upper Eagle Ford, which is a richer formation. So if my wells, for example, S1 and S2 have fractures that go into and develop into the upper Eagle Ford, and at the beginning start producing from upper Eagle Ford, their vertical drainage height will start diminishing with more and more production as the fracture tips close. And as a result, these 2 wells, S1 and S2, would start producing less and less of that rich fluid. So we would see a CGR trend that would keep decreasing even above dew point. And we wanted to look at that hypothesis with the example of this well. So if we look at the wells S1 and S2 here on the right-hand side, again, as I mentioned, based on that hypothesis, we would expect that this S1 and S2 would have decreasing CGR, both of them from the onset of production. However, luckily enough, S1 and S2 were operated at 2 distinct choke management policies. S1 had a constant choke at 12, and S2, on the contrary, has a ramp up of choke in the first 6 months until it reached its minimum bottom pressure. And that obviously resulted in decreasing CGRs. So it was very eye-opening to see that although that fluid heterogeneity and that variation in vertical height of drainage may have an impact in the CGR, choke management itself has a much higher and more dominant impact on production of CGR at the surface, and always almost masks every other effect of other hypotheses that are offered in the literature. Now, same thing for wells D1 and D2. In the deep layer, we can see that the D1 with a constant choke, stabilized choke, had a consistent uniform CGR, and well D2, just like well S1 with a ramp up in choke, had a lower CGR. So I guess I have shown you enough examples to establish this with you, that if you're having a ramp up of choke, an aggressive ramp up of choke at the first few months of production, we will have a CGR that will keep decreasing. So we will lose that potential of high CGR at CGRI. Now that would probably interest you to see how these wells did in terms of production of gas and condensate at the surface. So I'm going to show that to you for wells S1 and S2. So you can compare the cumulative production of condensate and gas for two wells from the same layer, same richness, same path, but with two different distinct choke strategies. So let's look at this plot here that is showing the gas production for well S1 and S2, or the fast drawdown and slow drawdown wells. In red, I'm showing the fast drawdown well, which was well S2, and in gray, I'm showing the gas production with time for the slow drawdown well. So we can observe that the fast drawdown, very naturally with its high size choke, will have a steep production, high initial rates of production of gas for as long as it is above its minimum bottom hole pressure. But around month 6 to 8, when the well reaches around 1,000 psi and maintained at 1,000 psi, we can see that there is the slowing down of gas production, and the well starts to have a smaller slope in the cume production. However, the slow drawdown well, although it has a slower production of gas at the beginning, it has a consistent, steady production of gas that necessarily does not slow down like that of the fast drawdown. And interestingly enough, in 40 months, it catches up to the gas production of the fast drawdown gas rate. Interestingly enough, for the condensate, if you look at the slow drawdown in gray and fast drawdown in green, we can observe that only in 6 months, the well with the slow drawdown produced enough condensate to catch up with the production of fast drawdown. And in the matter of almost 3 years, it produced 50% more condensate than the well with the faster drawdown, which was a very interesting and eye-opening observation for us. Obviously, both gas and condensate rates are initially higher with the faster drawdown. And if you're interested in our cash flow in the first year or 2 years or whatever that economic metric is, it's a no-brainer that the fast drawdown will have that attractive short production. But if you are more interested in a long-term profitability, then we may have a second look at the slow drawdown and how the condensate and gas production are catching up and even getting more past the 3 years. And obviously, this is partially due to less damage left behind in the reservoir. So whether or not the slow drawdown leads to a more profitable investment still remains a subject to the economic metrics of the operators, and every operator will have their different policies. And this is really not to prescribe what is best, and at the end of the day, your preferred economic metrics will rule how you manage your choke strategy. So I'm sure that I've repeated myself enough times that you don't need any summary, but I'm just going to leave you with just a few takeaways from today's talk. The shape of producing CGR profile is correlated with the trend of its corresponding choke history. So as we talked about many times today, a constant, stabilized or consistent choke size or drawdown strategy will promote a stabilized CGR at the high value of CGRI, and the steep ramp up of choke size will always trigger a rapid decline in CGR. Producing CGR always will track flowing bottom hole pressure regardless of the flow regime, and for as long as the well is operating below the saturation point. However, above the saturation point, a constant choke supports an almost constant CGR, and we expect that from classical PVT. However, a rapid increase in choke will have a consequent high gradient pressure drop, and it will prompt an immediate decline of CGR from CGRI. And for the example of the staggered pad that I showed you in the Eagle Ford, we saw that drawdown strategy controls the long-term condensate volume production. And in the given example, the slower drawdown led to 50% more condensate recovery in the span of the first 3 years of production. And with that, I would like to conclude and open the floor for any questions or any feedbacks or recommendations. As I mentioned earlier, often operators are unwilling to share their choke strategies, and unfortunately, this forces all of us to go up the same learning curve at a very high cost. So I'm happy that I was provided this opportunity to share some of our learnings, and I really look forward to feedback from you guys. And I guess today we're going to have some Q&A with Graham, but if you have any learnings that you would like to share with me, I will be very happily receiving them. I'm on LinkedIn, and please contact me, and let's share and learn together. Thank you.
Yalda, thank you so much. I really like those case studies to illustrate the topic. So one of the first questions we got is from Felipe Silva, and it says, for dry gas wells, have you seen any impact on water volumes based on choke management?
For dry gas wells, which is not, by the way, the topic of this study, we had the extensive study for the gas condensate. So I will not be telling you the exact truth if I can say I have developed an observation or correlation for dry gas wells, but I can talk about gas condensate wells. And it always has an impact on water production, but through our lessons learned and lookbacks that we've done on leaner wells, let's call them wet gas wells, we've noticed that regardless of how much water you produce, whether you produce it faster or slower, I've seen cases that at the end of the day, the health of the reservoir is not impacted by how fast you clean up, because that's a very interesting topic, and it was a concern for us too. Are we cleaning the water fast enough from these wells, and are we like letting the well breathe and produce more? But when I did a lot of these lookbacks into both rich and lean and wet gas wells, not dry gas, we've realized that yes, if you have a higher choke, you're going to clean up faster. But if you looked at 3 years or 4 years cum gas and condensate production, both wells with a high choke or low choke will have a healthy, relatively same health, and it will not impact the production of condensate or gas in the longer term.
Thanks, Yalda. I'm going to keep reading a few of the questions. If you're interested in reading the same text, Yalda, you can go to the chat window, go to the bottom, just so we're looking at the same thing, okay? When you get there, the next question is from Kurt Rucker. Chat, actually, sorry, on the far left there.
Not in the Q&A, oh, in the chat. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And then might have to scroll to the bottom. Okay, well, actually, we'll scroll up a little bit, I think. Kurt Rucker is going to be the
on the bottom.
Yeah,
I'm seeing the last here. Why don't we just take this question before that?
Sure.
Sure. They're asking about volatile oils and what additional factors. I have looked at many volatile oil wells in the Duvernay, and what I've observed is that just like the gas condensate, actually, I think I've shown 2 wells today with a very high CGRI of almost close to 300, 250, 270 barrels per million, that there's the same observations for them regarding of how CGR tracks bottom hole pressure. So almost the same observation.
Okay. I'm just
Sorry,
going to start at
I'm not seeing the particular
yeah,
question.
sure. I'll read it to you. If you will have to scroll, you'll have to scroll up a little bit in the chat window until it says Kurt Rucker. I'm just suggesting we read them in the order they're submitted. A little more. I think we just passed it there.
Okay.
It's about in the middle of the scroll bar.
Mine is changing.
Sorry, that was old. That's back when I interrupted and was saying the slides weren't updated. Yeah, so keep scrolling down until it says Kurt Rucker. It'll be about halfway down.
I see the right slide, Kurt Rucker. Do you want to read it for me then?
Yeah, that's fine. So it says interesting
Oh, here,
slides on.
interesting
There you go.
slide on drawdown rates and commodity prices. Is the data from your wells or other operators without pressure data? Do you find completions differences confuse interpretation of drawdown rates? If so, how do you handle correcting for facts to study field trends in drawdown? The slides that I showed you were the wells that we had, but our asset had been historically managed by prior operators to us. That's why I said this has been historically operated by 3 distinct managers. Yes, when you look at the degree of drawdown, actually that is your choke management. So completion effectiveness, is that the question? Completion differences do not play a role in how the observations that we have had. The observations are not changing with completion differences, but if you're asking whether we were having slow drawdowns in the past because we had not as dense completions in the past, I do not believe that necessarily, at least for the example that I showed you, was the case. It's really the strong correlation was between the commodity prices, because as I showed you, they're bimodal. We had wells that had very high drawdown and wells that had very slow drawdown at the same time with the same old and not modern completion up until the year 2018 and onwards, when we really switched to what we would like to call modern completion with higher densities of fractures and higher proppant densities, the intensities, and so on and so forth. But what has seemed to be holding through the years is that it's the commodity prices that have been, at the end of the day, ruling how we produce our assets in general.
Great. Yeah, I think Adrian has the next one there.
Adrian, how close was initial reservoir pressure to saturation for the slide 12? Okay, let's go to slide 12. Adrian, maybe a general answer to your question is, for all of these wells in the Eagle Ford, in the Karnes and the Dewitt, we know that we're not looking about below 9,000 psi. In the Dewitt, 10,000, 11, 12,000 psi for the initial reservoir pressure. You go further east, a little bit shallower, you can have lower initial pressures, but never less than maybe 9,000. And dew points, again, it's another topic that we all know is a little bit not well understood, or it's a subject of debate for unconventional reservoirs, because we talk about nanopore effects and suppression of phase envelope and hence the dew point. But the estimated dew points from our lab reports are around 3,800, 4,000 in the vicinity. So you're talking 10,000 for initial reservoir pressure and 4,000 for dew point. And so there's a long way to drop the reservoir pressure to the dew point, and still we're seeing that decreasing in the CGR. So no, it's not affected by proximity to the saturation pressure. Tyler, in slide 14, where you compare the CGR of the 2 wells, did you have information regarding surface conditions? Were they the separation paths the same? First of all, every well that I have shown, it's a very good question. Thanks for bringing that up, because it allows me the opportunity to add a couple layers of information to this study. Every well that has gone to this study, all those 100 wells, have been chosen from the wells that had their own wellhead separator. So none of these had a bulk and test separator. So the condensate and gas rates were metered at the well's particular individual separator. Secondly, all the profiles for condensate have been corrected for separator conditions, temperature, pressure, and composition through appropriate equation of states. So every profile that I've shown you has been normalized and corrected for separator conditions, and every one of them has had its own separator. So these two wells have had individual separators, and every single one of them has been corrected on a daily basis, average daily, to its separator pressure, temperature, and composition. I hope that answered your question.
There's one just above Tyler from Darren as well.
At what reservoir rock property threshold does this correlation stop to be the case? Shale, tight sand, Montney. I have not included Montney in this study, but an interesting observation has been that if you want to talk about, when you say shale tight sand, we're talking about the TOC content. And at the beginning, it was very interesting for me to see if higher TOCs versus smaller degrees of TOCs will have an impact on this CGR declination or anomaly above the dew point. Because one attractive theory that's out there that explains why we are having a decline in the CGR above dew point is that we're having more adsorbed gas released, and that adsorbed gas is diluting the CGR. And that's a popular theory. But if you want to just talk about adsorbed gas, then it should have a direct link with the TOC content. And for that, I studied some of these pads that had wells in the lower Eagle Ford all the way to upper Eagle Ford and Austin Chalk that had a TOC variation between 2% to 5-6%. And we noticed that the TOC content does not necessarily impact this this relationship of the direct relationship between choke ramp up and the linear decrease in CGR. So I'd say that if you went to reservoirs that have less TOC, you would still see this in this relationship. I'm happy I could conclude my talk a little bit faster so we can go through many good questions. There's so many of them, I don't want to pick any favorites, but in continuation of what we just talked about, I see Ross Bone is asking, what do you think is the mechanism for the anomaly? Ross, that's a very good question. As we talked about, there's multiple hypotheses. There's the adsorption that we just talked about, and for the longest time, it was one of my favorite hypotheses. But as I'm looking at the TOC content, I haven't yet found a relationship, but it's an ongoing investigation for us. In fact, we wrote a second paper that was presented last year at ATC that looks at the reversibility of the effect of CGR and choke, increasing choke, decreasing CGR, and is using adsorption as a theory to look at that. I would invite you to have a look at that paper. However, I would not say that I am convinced that adsorption is the mechanism. It could be one of the mechanisms. As we talked about the fluid heterogeneity, although I just showed you in the last slide that in the example of the staggered pad, we could not prove that fluid heterogeneity was the reason. Still, I cannot deny it because intuitively that should play apart in this. So I guess all these hypotheses that are out there to me are still valid. And maybe it's not one mechanism or the other, it's a combination of all these mechanisms that are playing a part in the CGR anomaly. I guess we're getting very close to time, Graham. If there's any other questions that you would like to bring up, maybe we have one more minute.
Sure, I'll just quickly look here. One thing that people seemed to like was we were looking at the CGR and pressure and choke trends versus time. But instead of time, looking at them as cumulative production would also be an interesting just way to validate the long-term effects as well.
But that was the last slide. Oh yeah, sorry, you're just emphasizing that this is what people liked about it. Yes, it's always important to look at the long-term cumulative production, and that's what goes directly into your economic evaluation. And for us, it's the same. If you want to balance between the short-term acceleration and the long-term effects for your reserves and resources assessments as well. That would be the first thing to look at the Q productions, yes.
Yeah, I think their particular suggestion was time would not be on here. It would be cum on the x-axis.
Oh, right, absolutely. We have, we obviously Q would be always a better because you're eliminating the operational issues and shut-ins and everything. And no doubt, it's always better to look at it that way. But in the case of this slide, because I wanted to show in how many months in general this has happened, I showed you time on the x-axis, but I'm 100% with you. Always look at your Q versus the cumulative production to eliminate all the operational shut-ins and issues.
One question that's I think easy to ask is was there any machine learning assisted model represented here? I'm guessing no. This is probably all physics based.
This was pure. This was pure observation, and obviously we later for our choke optimization I did a modeling work for slow drawdown versus fast drawdown, and the modeling results replicated what we had seen with observation. But no, that's pure numerical modeling and no machine learning study on this. Not yet.
Okay, perfect. Well, I know we're at the top of the hour, so if we have time, I'll see if Yalda is able to look at any of the outstanding questions later, and I'll try to consolidate those responses in a mass communication to everyone. Sure. And the last thing I want to mention is we've done some similar studies, with the Whitson Plus software in terms of bottom wall pressure versus cumulative condensate, ratios and condensate cum, and we found some similar results. So I'm just going to illustrate that picture as well in the follow-up for everyone, because it's always good to validate this and do it in a predictive way, if possible, if practical, right? So I really want to thank Yalda for this wonderful presentation, for her time, and for all the great work she's contributed to the industry. So thank you to everyone else. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Everyone's going to get a follow-up with this link so we can rewatch the recording. Thanks again. Okay. Bye-bye.